There's a particular kind of failure that nobody warns you about. It's not the kind where the dream collapses and you lose everything in the rubble. It's the kind where the dream succeeds, fully, visibly, beyond what you hoped, and you still end up with nothing. This is the story of a man who built something real with his own hands in one of the most beautiful places on earth. He just didn't know he was building it for someone else. The first time I walked that strip of beach in Panglao, I stood there for about 10 minutes without saying anything. That's not like me. I've been a talker my whole working life. 30 years managing construction sites will do that. You learn to fill silence with decisions, or someone else will fill it with problems. But that beach stopped me cold. The water was the kind of blue that doesn't look real. The sand was so white it hurt to look at directly. There were fishing boats pulled up at one end, and a handful of palm trees leaning out over the water like they were trying to get a better look at themselves, and I stood there with my boots still on. I hadn't even thought to take them off, and I thought, this is it. This is the place. Salvacion was standing beside me. She'd brought me out here on a borrowed motorbike. 2 of us on it, with me holding the seat frame, because I wasn't going to put my hands on a woman's waist the 3rd time I'd met her. She was pointing out the boundaries of the land her family owned. 2 hectares running back from the shoreline, most of it coconut palms and scrub. And she was talking about what could be done with it, what had been done with similar plots 2 kilometers east near Alona Beach, what the tourism numbers looked like for Panglao Island in the dry season. She was 31 then, and she knew the land and the business side of it better than I knew my own street in Perth. She spoke about occupancy rates the way I talked about load-bearing capacity, like someone who had spent years thinking about it before I arrived. People come here and they want simple, she said. Not luxury, just clean, honest, beautiful. That's what this beach gives you for free. You only have to build around it. I already knew I was going to do it. I just needed to hear it said out loud. Let me back up, because none of that makes sense without the part that came before it. I retired from construction management at 61. Technically, my body had been requesting retirement for a couple of years by that point, a knee that argued with me every morning, and a back that had opinions about cold weather. And after the Fremantle Port expansion project wrapped up, my business partner Leon and I agreed it was a clean place to stop. We'd built the company together over 2 decades, Leon and I, and we sold our share of it to a younger crew who'd been with us for years and knew what they were doing. The money was good, not extraordinary, but solid. I walked away with enough to be comfortable in Perth for the rest of my life, if I was sensible, and enough to do something interesting if I wasn't. My marriage had ended 4 years before that. Sandra and I had separated quietly after the kids were grown. Our son Callum was 28 and working in Brisbane. Our daughter Neve was 30 and had her own life in Melbourne. And the separation was one of those long overdue things that both people know is coming and still manage to be surprised by when it arrives. No drama, no particular villain. Just 2 people who had grown into shapes that no longer fit the same space. Sandra kept the house in Subiaco. I moved into a flat in Fremantle and told myself I preferred the water views, which was true, but not entirely the point. I'd traveled through Southeast Asia twice in my 50s. Once for a conference in Singapore, once on a proper holiday through Thailand and Vietnam that a mate organized. I liked the pace of it. I liked being somewhere that had no history with me. I liked that nobody there knew anything about the port expansion, or my marriage, or the knee, or any of the accumulated weight of being Brendan McGregor of Perth, Western Australia, age 61, former something, ex-husband, empty nester, man in a Fremantle flat trying to work out what comes next. I went to Bohol on the 3rd trip, on a recommendation from a woman at my gym who'd honeymooned there. She'd said it was quieter than Cebu, less touristy than Palawan, and that the diving was the best she'd ever done. I don't dive, but I went anyway. I stayed at a small guest house on Panglao Island for 2 weeks, and spent most of my time on the beach, reading, eating whatever the woman who ran the kitchen cooked that day, and thinking about what I actually wanted the next 20 years to look like. I met Salvacion on the 4th day. She was working the front desk at a resort 2 properties down from my guest house, and I stopped in to ask about renting kayaks. She didn't have any, but she told me where to find them, and then she asked where I was from, and I said Perth, and she said her cousin had worked in Darwin for 2 years, and what was Australia like, and we talked for about 40 minutes before I remembered I'd come in about kayaks. We had dinner 3 nights later. Her idea, technically. She mentioned a restaurant near the church in Panglao town that did the best grilled tuna she'd ever eaten, and I said that sounded like something I needed to experience, and she said she was free on Thursday, and that was that. We ate fish and rice, and talked until the place started stacking chairs around us, and I walked back to my guest house along the dark road, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was that the evening hadn't been long enough. I'm not going to tell you I fell in love with her in those 2 weeks, because I don't think that's what happened. What happened was more specific than that. I found someone who made the idea I'd been half-forming, the resort, the land, the business built with my own hands instead of someone else's, feel possible in a practical way, rather than just a daydream way. She knew the local government requirements for tourism businesses. She knew which contractors were reliable, and which ones would extend your timeline by 6 months and blame the weather. She knew what foreign nationals could and couldn't own under Philippine law, and she told me that clearly, up front, without me asking, which I later understood was important information delivered at a carefully chosen moment. Land has to be in a Filipino name, she said, on our 6th or 7th evening together, matter-of-factly, over San Miguel on her family's porch. Or a corporation, but that's complicated. A lot of foreigners do it through a spouse or a long-term partner. It's normal here. Everyone knows how it works. I nodded. I stored that away. I didn't ask the follow-up questions I should have asked. Her family's land was exactly what I'd been imagining. 2 hectares, beach frontage, coconut palms for shade, and a location that the emerging Panglao tourism market hadn't quite reached yet, which meant the prices were still reasonable and the competition was still thin. Her father had farmed coconuts on it for 30 years and was ready to see something else done with it. Her mother was quiet and watchful and made the best champurrado I've ever tasted. Her younger sister Rosario was 26 and sharp and handled herself with the confidence of someone who had been the smart one in every room she'd walked into since childhood. Salvacion had a boyfriend. I found this out from Rosario, not from Salvacion herself, and I found it out about 3 months into the planning stage of the resort, by which point I had already wired an initial $45,000 to a joint account we'd set up for construction costs. The boyfriend's name was Ferdy. He was from Tagbilaran. He sold motorbikes. Salvacion and I were not, at that point, in a romantic relationship. We were business partners with an emotional charge that neither of us had directly named, and I told myself that Ferdy was therefore not my business. I believed that for about another 4 months. We broke ground on the resort in March of what I'll call year 1. I'd flown back to Perth after my initial 2-week trip, sorted my finances, spoken to a solicitor friend who gave me a look over the top of his glasses when I explained the ownership structure and said, "Brendan, mate, are you sure about this?" And I'd said yes, I was sure. And he'd said okay, it's your call, and drafted me a business agreement between Salvacion and myself that felt substantial at the time and turned out to be worth roughly what it cost to print. I was back in Bohol by February. I rented a room in a small house near the beach and started managing the construction myself, which was the part of this whole adventure that I was unambiguously good at. 30 years of telling people how to build things had given me a particular fluency, with labor and materials and timelines, and even with the language barrier. My Tagalog was non-existent. My Cebuano was worse. I could read a construction site the way some people read faces. I knew when a pour was wrong by the sound of it. I knew when a crew was pacing themselves for overtime. I knew quality from the touch of it. We built 12 cottages, proper ones, solid concrete foundations, hardwood frames, bamboo accents, private outdoor showers, each one facing the water through gaps in the coconut palms. We built a main pavilion with an open kitchen and a bar, and long communal tables where guests could eat breakfast and watch the boats come in. We installed a water filtration system that I sourced from a supplier in Cebu and drove down myself in a hired truck. I tiled bathrooms and ran electrical conduit and argued with a roofing contractor for 2 weeks until he agreed to redo a section that wasn't draining correctly. Salvacion managed the booking systems, the staffing, the supplier accounts, and the government registrations. She was genuinely exceptional at it. She had an instinct for hospitality that I didn't have and couldn't have learned. She knew how to make guests feel taken care of before they knew what they needed. She trained the staff with patience and precision, and she had the resort's social media presence generating inquiries before we'd even opened. I was proud of her. I told her so, often. By the time we opened in October of year 1, Salvacion and I had become a couple. I'm not sure exactly when it happened. There wasn't a conversation about it, not a formal one. She stopped going home some nights. I stopped pretending I wanted her to. Ferdy, I gathered, was no longer in the picture, though I didn't ask and she didn't volunteer, and I told myself that was also fine. The first dry season was beyond what I'd hoped. Every cottage booked out for Christmas and New Year. We had guests from Germany, Australia, South Korea, the UK, a group of divers from France who stayed for 10 days and left a review that I printed out and still have somewhere. Salvacion was managing check-ins and check-outs, and the restaurant rotation, and the staff schedules, and doing it all with a composure that made me feel, genuinely, that I had found the right partner in every sense of the word. I transferred another $30,000 in January of year 2 to cover what Salvacion said was a slower than expected revenue period over November and December. The tail end of the rainy season, she explained, was always soft. The money would tide them over until the dry season revenue kicked in. I sent it without much question. We were partners. That's what partners do. I went back to Perth in February of year 2 for 6 weeks. Callum's wedding, a medical check on my knee, some financial administration I'd been putting off. While I was there, I asked Salvacion to start sending me the monthly booking reports so I could track our occupancy from a distance. She sent them. I looked at them over coffee in my Fremantle flat and saw what I expected to see. Steady but modest numbers, 40 to 50% occupancy. Not spectacular but sustainable. The kind of thing that would build over time as the reviews accumulated and the reputation grew. I thought, this is going to take a few more years to get to where I want it. That's fine. I knew it wouldn't be fast. I flew back in April and spent 3 weeks at the resort. It looked good. The staff seemed settled. 2 of the cottages had been repainted and looked sharper for it. I walked the property every morning before breakfast and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something with his hands and can see it standing. What I didn't see, because I didn't know to look for it, was the second set of records. The thing about construction management is that it teaches you to trust systems. You build the system, you check the system periodically, and if the system is functioning, you trust it and move on to the next problem. That's efficient. On a construction site, it's essential. In a business partnership where the person managing the systems has a separate agenda, it is a very expensive habit. Salvacion managed 2 booking platforms. The one she showed me was the official account I had access to. She'd set it up using my email address, so I could log in any time, and I had logged in, during those 6 weeks in Perth, and looked at the numbers, and nodded, and gone back to my coffee. What I didn't know was that a second account existed under a slightly different business name, same resort, same cottages, same bank of stunning beach photos, registered under Rosario's contact details, and routed to a separate payment account that I had no visibility into. The guests who booked through the second platform got the same cottages, the same staff, the same breakfast. They just paid into a different account. And the second platform, I would later discover, was the busier one. I found out the way you find out things you've been avoiding knowing. Slowly, then all at once. It started with a guest named Henrik. He was a Danish architect who had stayed at the resort twice, once in year 1 and once in year 2, and he tracked me down through a travel forum where I'd mentioned the resort by name in an early post about building it. He sent me a message asking if I was the Australian owner, and when I confirmed it, he said he wanted to ask me something privately. We got on a video call. Henrik was a careful, precise man who chose his words slowly and looked at you steadily while he spoke. He said he wanted to flag something because he wasn't sure if I was aware of it. He said he'd tried to book through the resort's official website for a third stay and found it was showing only partial availability. He then found the second listing on a different platform, identical photos, slightly lower nightly rate, and booked through that instead. When he arrived, everything was the same cottage, same staff, same breakfast, but the receipt he received was from a different business entity. I assumed it was just an administrative thing, he said. But then I was talking to one of the other guests over dinner, and she mentioned she'd also booked through a different platform and paid a lower rate. And I thought, either the owner knows about this and it's intentional, or the owner doesn't know, and he should. I thanked Henrik and got off the call and sat in the main pavilion for a long time looking out at the water. I didn't go to Salvacion that evening. I went through what I had access to first: our official booking records, the joint account statements, the receipts from our listed suppliers. Then I rang Leon in Perth. Leon had spent 2 decades managing the financial side of our construction business and had the kind of brain that spotted inconsistencies the way other people spot spelling mistakes. I sent him everything I could pull, and he rang me back in 4 hours. "Brendan," he said. "Mate, what have you got access to in terms of the property registration, the business name, the bank accounts for the operation?" I told him. It wasn't much. "Okay," he said carefully. "Let me ask you something. In the last year, how many nights do you think those 12 cottages were occupied?" I said probably around 150 nights each, based on the reports Salvacion sent. He said, "Because looking at your joint account inflows, if you were running at 50% occupancy at the rates you told me you were charging, the revenue should be roughly double what's coming in. Either your rates are half what you think they are, or your occupancy is half what it looks like, or someone's banking the other half somewhere else." I already knew what it was. I think I'd known for about 3 hours at that point. But hearing Leon say it made it real in a different way. I asked Salvacion the next morning. We were sitting at the long table in the pavilion with coffee, which was where we usually started the day, and I put my phone on the table between us, with Henrik's message on the screen. I watched her read it. She didn't rush. She set the phone back down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately classify. Not guilt exactly, not panic, something more considered than either of those. "Where did this come from?" she said. I told her. She said he misunderstood the setup. I said, "Walk me through the setup then." And she did, calmly, clearly. She explained that the second platform was a necessary operational decision, that the official platform had high commission fees that ate into margins, and that routing some bookings through a lower fee alternative was standard practice in the industry, and that all the revenue ultimately went back into the business. I said, "Show me the account." She said, "It's in Rosario's name. Rosario manages that side of things." I said, "I'd like to see the statements." There was a pause, long enough to mean something. Then she said, "Brendan, the business is in my name. The land is in my father's name, now transferred to mine. I've been running this operation for 3 years. You've been here maybe 8 months in total." I said, "I've put over 200,000 Australian dollars into this business." She said, "And the resort is worth more than that now. You've had accommodation, you've had a life here, you've had income from the operation." I said, "I haven't had income. I've been sending money from Perth because you told me the resort was struggling." She looked at me steadily. "The account you see was struggling. I told you that truthfully." That sentence just hung there in the morning air between us. The water was brilliant behind her. Somewhere down the beach a rooster was making its opinion known. One of the housekeeping staff was crossing the compound with a stack of fresh towels, not looking at us. I understood then that I was not going to get the statements. I understood that the conversation we were having was not a disagreement between business partners. It was an explanation being offered to someone who had just been told what his position actually was. I went back to my room and rang Leon again. He'd been doing more digging overnight, running numbers, and what he told me took about 20 minutes to absorb. Based on the average occupancy rates for comparable Panglao properties in the same period, and the room rates Salvacion had originally quoted me, our 12 cottages should have generated somewhere between a $420,000 and $480,000 in revenue over 3 years of operation. The joint account I had visibility into had received a $168,000, which meant, by Leon's conservative estimate, that a $310,000 had gone somewhere else. $310,000. That's what the numbers said. I also knew, from a conversation I'd had 6 months earlier with a contractor who'd done some additional work on the property, that Rosario had recently purchased a parcel of land in Tagbilaran, and that Salvacion's family had expanded their hardware supply business, the one her father ran as a side operation, significantly in the past 2 years, and that a new vehicle, a double-cab pickup that Salvacion's brother drove, had appeared in the family compound without any explanation I could recall being given. I sat on the edge of my bed in that rented room with the ceiling fan turning overhead, and looked at the wall, and tried to work out what exactly I had been for the past 3 years. Not a partner. Not an investor. Not really. Investors get returns and visibility. Not even a victim in the straightforward sense, because a straightforward victim gets robbed of something and at least knows what happened. I had been the funding mechanism for someone else's ambition. I had provided the capital, the construction expertise, and the credibility. A foreign investor gives a resort a certain legitimacy that pure local ownership doesn't always carry, and in return, I had received the appearance of partnership, the experience of living in a beautiful place, and the feeling, right up until Henrik's message arrived, that I was building something that was partly mine. None of it was mine. Not legally. Not in any way that could be enforced. The land was hers. The business registration was hers. The bank accounts were hers and her sister's. The agreement I'd had drawn up in Perth, which my solicitor friend had looked at with that concerned expression, turned out to have, upon proper review by a Philippine attorney, exactly the enforceability I feared, which was minimal. I called Callum from the pavilion that evening. He was 3 hours ahead in Brisbane, and he picked up on the second ring, and when I told him what had happened, clearly, without dramatizing it, the way you relay information when you're still in a kind of numb shock, he went very quiet for a moment, and then said, "Dad, what do you need?" I told him I needed to think. He said, "Can you come home?" I said I didn't know yet. He said, "I'm going to ring Neve, and we're going to talk tonight, and I'm going to call you back tomorrow morning, okay? Don't do anything yet." I said okay. I sat there after we hung up and watched the sun go down over the South China Sea, and thought about the morning 2 years ago, when I'd tiled one of those bathroom floors myself, on my hands and knees in the heat, cutting each tile to fit, because the cottage footprint wasn't perfectly square, and a good floor requires precision. I'd done it because I wanted it done right, because it was mine. Callum rang back as promised. He and Neve had spoken to a family friend who was a solicitor, not the same one from Perth, a different one, someone who had experience with overseas property disputes. The advice was not encouraging. Without registered ownership of the land or the business, my position was essentially that of an unsecured creditor with a very difficult cross-jurisdiction case to pursue. Legal action was possible, but the cost and timeline and uncertainty of outcome made it, in the solicitor's words, a difficult road to recommend. The practical advice was, document everything, consult a Philippine attorney to understand the local options, and make clear decisions about whether to continue the relationship or exit. Exit. That was the word he used. I spent 2 weeks after that in a strange in-between state. I was still at the resort. Salvacion and I were still under the same roof, still eating meals together, still operating with a surface-level civility that felt surreal given what I knew. We didn't discuss it again after that morning in the pavilion. She went about managing the resort with her usual composure. I went about my days with a heaviness I couldn't shake. I spoke to a Philippine attorney in Cebu who had handled similar cases. She was direct with me in a way I appreciated. She said that my position was weak but not hopeless, that there were avenues related to unjust enrichment and the documentation of my financial contributions, that it would take years and cost significantly, and that even a successful outcome might yield a fraction of what I'd lost. She said she had seen this pattern before. Not often, but enough to recognize it. She said the most important thing I could do immediately was to stop putting money in. I had sent, in total, $247,000 of my own money into the resort across 3 years, not counting the value of my time and expertise. The $310,000 shortfall in revenue represented what should have been my return but had been diverted. The combined picture was not something I could look at directly for very long. I arranged to meet Salvacion properly one evening, asked if we could sit down together, properly, not at the breakfast table with staff around us. We sat in the 2 chairs on the porch of the cottage I'd been using as my own, facing the garden, and I told her what Leon and I had found, and what the attorney had said. I told her clearly, and without anger. I'd made a decision by that point to say what needed to be said, without letting it become a scene, because I was 63 years old, and I wasn't going to spend whatever dignity I had left on a shouting match on a beach porch in Panglao. She listened. When I finished, she said, "I know this is hard for you." I said, "I'd like to know your version of it." She said, "My version is that I kept this resort alive for 3 years. I managed the staff, I handled the guests, I built the reputation. Without me knowing how to run this, it would have failed in the first season." I said, "That's true. And without my money and my construction knowledge, it wouldn't have been built." She said, "Yes." I said, "So where does that leave us?" She looked at the garden for a while. Then she said, "The resort is registered in my name, on my family's land. That's the legal reality. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't force you to invest. You came here looking for something and you found it. The resort is real. The years were real. What you built is standing." I said, "What I built is standing. I just don't own any of it." She didn't answer that, and in her not answering it, I heard everything she'd been not saying for 3 years. I left Bohol in May. I packed what I'd come with, not much. I'd always traveled light, and arranged a boat to the mainland, and a flight to Manila, and from Manila to Perth. Callum picked me up from the airport, and he didn't say anything when he saw me. He just picked up my bag and put his arm around my shoulders, and we walked to the car. Neve flew over from Melbourne the following weekend. We all had dinner at Callum's. His wife cooked a roast, and I sat at that table with my 2 children and their partners, and I felt, for the first time in weeks, that I was in a room where I was simply their father and nothing else was required of me. After dinner, after the dishes, Callum sat with me in his backyard with 2 beers and asked me honestly, did I regret going? I thought about it seriously before I answered. I said no, not entirely. The work was real. The things I built were real. The first dry season, watching 12 cottages full of people eating breakfast by the water, that was real, and it was good, and nobody can unreal it. I regret the $247,000. I regret the trust I extended without the due diligence to back it up. I regret that I confused the warmth of a place and a person with the safety of them. But I don't regret the beach that first morning. I don't regret the tile floor I cut to fit. I don't regret the water filtration system I drove down from Cebu in a truck in the heat. I don't regret learning that I could still do something physical and meaningful and skilled in my 60s, when everyone in Perth had already decided I was retired. What I learned, and this is the part I'd give to any man who's standing on a beautiful beach somewhere thinking about building something, is that expertise and enthusiasm are not enough. I knew how to build. I knew how to manage people. I knew quality from mediocrity, and I could work in the heat, and I could solve problems fast. What I didn't know was the legal architecture of what I was walking into, and I didn't know it because I didn't ask the right questions at the right time, and I didn't ask them because a part of me was afraid that asking would reveal something I didn't want to know. That's not her fault. That's mine. Leon visited me in Fremantle about a month after I got back. We had lunch at a place on the water and talked through the numbers one more time, not to find something we'd missed, but just so I could hear it all said out loud by someone I trusted and then be done with it. After lunch, we walked along the beach path, and Leon said, "What are you going to do now?" And I said I wasn't sure yet, and he said, You've got the skills and you've got the time. You could build something here. And I said maybe. I've been back in Perth for 4 months now. The knee has had the surgery it needed, and I'm walking without arguing with every step, which is a genuine improvement. I see Callum and his wife regularly. Neve and I have video calls on Sunday mornings, which is something we didn't do before Bohol, and I count that as one of the things the whole experience gave me. I had a call from a former colleague who's involved in a social housing project in the northern suburbs. They need someone to manage the construction phase. Good work. Meaningful work. The kind of thing that used up 30 years of me and still has somewhere to go. I think I'm going to say yes. I still have the printout of that French diving group's review. It's in a folder in my desk drawer. 5 stars. It says the resort was the most beautiful place they'd ever stayed in the Philippines, that the cottages were built with obvious care, that the breakfast was extraordinary, and that they hope to come back. I hope they do. I genuinely mean that. The place deserves to be enjoyed. I built it well. Whatever else happened, I built it well, and the water there is still that particular impossible blue, and somewhere in Panglao the morning light is still coming through the gaps in the coconut palms and landing on 12 cottage floors, and one of them has a bathroom with hand-cut tiles that fit perfectly because I was there, and I cared, and I did it right. Nobody can take that part. The rest of it, the money, the records, the $310,000 that moved through Rosario's account into land and vehicles and a hardware store in Tagbilaran. That's gone. I've made my peace with that, mostly. Some nights more than others. What I haven't made peace with, and might not, is the particular sentence Salvacion said that last evening on the porch. Not the hard one about the legal reality, the other one. You came here looking for something, and you found it. Because she wasn't wrong, I did find it. I found exactly what I was looking for. Purpose, craft, beauty, connection, the feeling of building something that was mine, in some essential way, even if not in any legal one. I just didn't know, until it was too late to matter, that finding something and owning it are two completely different things. That distinction is what I'm still learning to live with. Some mornings it sits heavier than others. But I get up, I make coffee, I walk down to the water here in Fremantle, where the light is different but still decent, and I stand there for a while, and then I go back inside and get on with it. That's what you do. That's all you can do.